How can you have a series on hate and not deal with the clash or the battle of the sexes, eh? One of the interesting things about YouTube is it introduces you to all kinds of ideas that you find more or less fringe at the beginning, but then you realize that there's a sub-dialogue or a dialectic or a discourse taking place surrounding them, and it really fascinates you. As I mentioned to a lot of people in the past, I'm a trade unionist, and I'm used to dealing with politically correct milieu. In fact, I'm quite good at it. I can navigate those waters quite effectively. I don't really make such an effort to do it on YouTube, but I can do it if I need to. I'm also a 50-year-old male who finally, just half a decade ago, got married and bred. So I went through quite a long period of serial monogamy, which I think is the period in life for a male where you become either, I don't know, in your own view of things, realistic about the opposite sex, and I'm sure this goes for women too, or you become something along the lines of turned off by the whole thing, the whole interaction between the sexes. That fascinates me, but it's such a odd, from my perspective, odd discussion that I don't really see how it can actually go anywhere. I can see how, in a certain context, it can actually solve certain problems in individuals' lives, but I don't really see as a movement how radical feminism or angry man-hating feminism or whatever you want to call it, there's a million terms out there to discuss that kind of thing, is really going to solve anything, because the other half of the human population is always going to be an obstacle to that, and vice versa, to the more misogynistic or female avoidant type philosophies. Now, forgive me, I'm not that well versed in the in the lingo or in the language that goes along with and the allusions that go along with all of this. But as I say, I've been around the block a few times, and when I hear people, self-describe MGTOWs, men going their own way or whatever, describing why they became like this, I can completely sympathize. I come from a matriarchal culture, the Irish Catholic culture, which is overtly very sexist, but it's totally dominated by women. I think that's one of the central sticking points, tangentially here, between the Catholic and Protestant communities in Northern Ireland, by the way. I think the Protestants are a patriarchy and the Catholics are a matriarchy, and even I guess may actually be carrying on even as they become increasingly secularized, I guess, which, although I suppose in Ulster has a long way to go. But be that as it may, I've seen my my share of domineering, manipulative, self-interested women. And not always using their female talents in everyone's interest. And I don't mean just sexually either. I'm talking about maternal treatment of others, your view of all the men you know, this kind of thing, and how you comport yourself around the opposite sex. I get all of that. I understand how some people can get sort of turned off by the entire thing and just sort of say, this isn't what it's being presented to me as. Women just aren't like this. Now, and by the way, I'm just talking about this from the male perspective. You could go on for hours about what heels men are towards women. I get it. That's goes without saying if you ask me. I'm as guilty as the next guy. The stuff that I did when I was a lot younger to get what I wanted out of women, I'm not particularly proud of, but I was a stupid young man who did what all young men that age did to get what they wanted from women. So there are women out there who are probably bitter with me for being such a jerky kind of male. Having said that, I like to think that I have a realistic appraisal of what women actually are. And I think that I'm realistic about what I am as well, because it's not as if my motives for approaching females are completely altruistic either. I've always wanted something from them, and I've been prepared to dangle things in front of them my entire life to get what I wanted from them. And I've had things dangled in front of me, and then I've been played like a fish on the line and all that kind of thing. And I think that both sexes do this. This has not embittered me in terms of relationships with women. Not in the least. In a strange kind of way, it has actually made it more interesting, made it more lively. I think that relationships, as I understand them, are things that have to be nurtured until you're dead. You can't just rest on your laurels, ever. I describe my philosophy as riding the tiger. You might as well call it that in terms of my philosophy of relationships. It's always going to be give and take. It's always going to be push and push back. It's always going to have subtle antagonism built into it. I think that the yin and yang thing is, we fight among ourselves, but we kind of belong together in spite of ourselves, or perhaps because of ourselves, or whatever. Our very bodies seem to be designed to accommodate each other, but we fight and we destroy each other and we cause all kinds of problems. Now, what's my view of the whole thing? Well, anyone who's watched my videos knows that I'm fairly familiar with the culture of the cultures, I guess, of the Far East, in particular Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, very few cultures have a more, ambivalent relationship or view of the relationship between the genders as Southeast Asia does. As I say, it's a very gay-friendly society, all of them. From the Muslim Indonesians to the Buddhist Thais to the Catholic Filipinos. It's pretty okay to be gay in their society. But it's also rampantly sexist, and they also have very strict roles between men and women. It's often a very sexist society, and oftentimes there's elements of sexism of the female and the male type sort of competing with each other and fighting with each other. One of the more interesting things about the cultures of Southeast Asia, and I think the Far East in general, is that they have extremely well-defined male and female roles, and it's almost understood that this is an antagonistic dynamic in some ways. Now, I'm generalizing here, of course, but again, you notice things in other people's cultures that you might actually not notice in your own, simply because you don't really question that which you live as much as you question something that you're being introduced to. You take, for example, certain stereotypes, like the cute little Japanese teenager who's in her photos, and she just looks so impossibly adorably cute, and you can have almost extremely carnal thoughts about that female and just how ridiculously over the top delicate female she is. You get into a conversation with a Japanese male, and he'll say, "Oh yeah, that's all very well, and it's a very good act, but that's what you see is not what you get. There's something else there as well. This is something that's being dangled in front of you to sort of hook you." But of course, being a guy, the Japanese male will say, you get hooked anyway. But it's best to know that you're being hooked than actually not know that you're being hooked. It's best to go into this with your eyes wide open rather than all idealistic and hook, line, and sinker, taken in by this impossibly adorable, cute little Japanese woman. The stereotypical effect that this pop type Japanese girl has on particularly Western males. Be careful is the thinking. It's not what it seems. This is the way it's looked at in Southeast Asia as well. Oh yeah, they're extremely attractive, but you've really got to watch it around them. I don't know if that's an attitude that anyone here is particularly comfortable with having. I don't necessarily have that myself, but there's elements of it in my view of women. I sort of go, okay, we each want something out of the other one, and I'm always reminding myself to keep my wits about me when I'm dealing even with my wife to this day. There's things I want from her, things she wants from me, and we mustn't idealize each other to the point where we can fall under each other's spell. I don't want to fall under my wife's spell any more than I'm sure she wants to be completely and utterly dependent upon me. If I want my wife to actually make my life worth living, then that gives her enormous power over me, which is okay if she wasn't a flesh and blood human being with flaws just like me. I've got to sort of... I can rely on her for many things, but I've got to for my own definition of myself as a person, for my own personhood, I can only rely upon myself for that, if that. I don't know if there's anything I can rely on. It seems like a constant work in progress, always being updated. But there is elements of this idea that the relationship between the genders is inherently antagonistic in many ways. Not always, because we get along wonderfully sometimes, and we clash like you wouldn't believe in other times. And I think that's any relationship is like that. It's a constant work in progress. And one of the interesting things that I find in this modern sort of feminist MGTOW sort of discourse that's taking place is this idea of misplaced idealism turning into hatred. Again, I'm not a big fan of ideals. We are humans. We shit. Our shit stinks. Women's shit stinks as much as men's does. There's no point in blinding yourself to that. Not all men are knights in shining armor. Some men have moments of utter weakness and wimpiness that kind of turns a woman's stomach. It's just so unmanly, regardless of how modern and feminist they want to be. A sniveling, self-doubting male is something that's going to turn a lot of women off. We're human beings. We can't help but be what we are. But again, I could see how you could get poisoned by this because your ideals were a little bit too high when you got into the whole racket. Mine were extremely high when I was younger, but I don't know, I seem to navigate around it more successfully than some people. My age, some people that I know, I'm 51, some of the people that I know have gone sort of, I don't know, very blasé, I guess, about the relationship between the sexes, even in their own relationships. It's, okay, yeah, I'm happily married with my wife, but the passion is gone, and we're just sort of coasting through life, etc. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not what it used to be. It's not a ride anymore. It's just sort of you're coasting. If you're lucky, you can maintain that for most of your life, which is, I think, what most people hope for. And then there's people who have actually gone completely bitter on the whole thing. I know some women who are pretty bitter about men, and I know some men that are pretty bitter about women. My view, and keeping with my general view of everything, is to try and integrate these two and allow for them in certain contexts and in certain parts of your life, certain parts of your thinking, so that it doesn't actually turn into out and out hate. How you don't end up hating the other gender. How do you do that? How do you, let's say you have a realistic, one might even say, I don't know, jaundiced view of the opposite sex. You've been burned a number of times by typically male or typically female games, tricks, betrayals, this kind of thing. I'm assuming, of course, that people don't want to become bitter. That's a big assumption to make. But let's assume you don't want to become bitter. How can you deal with that? Like, how can you deal with the fact that women have all these things that really drive you crazy, and you've had so many eye-openers that sort of have left you sadder or angrier but wiser, but you still, how do you maintain a healthy relationship with the women of this world and the women in your life with this realistic point of view? Well, I think you can integrate I wouldn't say a sexist view of the genders, which I think that is the second you start talking about gender, you're sexist. If you're gonna say that you're gonna examine the relations between the genders, you're moving into sexist territory here, because you're saying there's fundamentally a difference between the two. Now, I guess I would say, how do I deal with that sexist dynamic? The sexism that dare not speak its name. The sexism that underpins all discussion of gender. Well, one thing that I would say is you got to remind yourself that you do want things out of each other. You do like things. It's like my relationship, I mention in many videos, to reality itself, to life itself. A lot of people say that life isn't worth living because of all the terrible experiences that they've had or they've seen, or the things that they've studied in life that have taught them that life isn't worth living, or they've come to the conclusion that this is the way it is, etc., etc. And I say, yes, even if you allow for all of that, it can still be made to be worth living, but you have to take the initiative to do so. I practice a type of yoga which is aimed particularly at that. It's called Tantra, which I always mention. It's the life-affirming as opposed to the denying type of Eastern philosophy, where you want to enjoy the wheel of existence as opposed to get off it, if you want to use those sorts of metaphors. Now, I would say that my view of the genders, the sexes, is the same way. I would say that I understand what women are. I understand, or at least I understand what they can be, what they have the potential to be, good and bad, and indifferent and whatever. And I also want things out of them. I don't want to banish them from my life. And I accept the fact that they have enormous warts, that they have enormous, and I mean that metaphorically, of course, they have enormous imperfections, and there's enormous snares. Enormous traps. In many ways, this image of Eve with her apple, hey, you want this? I think that's an apt metaphor. The Indian view of reality itself, of the appearances of reality before our eyes, Maya, the idea that what we see is actually real, is generally seen as a feminine thing. It's the idea that reality itself is something of a manifestation of the feminine guile that underpins the entire physical universe. That's why you get this. I'm always referring to her, even though I don't believe in any gods at all, but I like this metaphorical portrayal of reality, and particularly of women. That's, of course, Mother Kali. She appears throughout tantric imagery, and she's seen as just a depiction of reality and a depiction of the physical universe that creates us and consumes us with equal enthusiasm. The primal mother. And, you see her with, she's got all these men's heads hanging from her girdle here, and she's got a necklace of skulls and all these weapons, and she's dancing on Shiva, who, there's many explanations for this. Shiva is the god, male, ultimately, utterly male god. She's dancing on him. Some people say he's actually pretended to be a corpse because that's how you calm her down, and she really can't be calmed down. She is sort of dynamism itself. Incredibly complex artistic imagery behind all of this, which I only take as artistic license. I don't believe in any gods. But again, it's interesting that the very branch of philosophy, Eastern philosophy, that I'm most interested in and most drawn to, is one that has, in many ways, the most ferocious depiction of the feminine, and the insistence that ultimately, when you get right down to it, this is utterly good, but you have to see the goodness. You have to see beyond the appearances, beyond the first impressions, beyond the first times when you get your fingers burned. The first 100, 200 times when you get your fingers burned by reality, by the world, by the universe, by everything. You've got to see beyond this. You have to have the strength to move beyond the appearances, move beyond everything to what is the ultimate principle behind the entire thing, which is, of course, called Shakti, the female energy, the feminine force that underpins the physical reality of everything. Again, just silly imagery, silly metaphors for something that I think you can actually describe without recourse to these things. But, again, there's just different ways to describe the same thing, and a poetic description of something is just as useful as a rational description of something. So, my view, no way. There's no way I'm ever going to hate women. Or I can't imagine myself ever ending up in that situation. Equally problematic or equally unlikely, I like to tell myself, and again, I like to tell myself I'm never going to end up being a MGTOW or any kind of avoidant kind of, male who wants to sort of withdraw from females. I also don't think that I'm ever likely to sort of abase myself towards women as I have in the past and allowed myself to be something of a doormat. And I think every young man goes through this. But, you got to be realistic about yourself. You were willing to abase yourself before something because you wanted something out of this, right? So let's be honest here. Let's be realistic. Each of us wants something from the other one. That's just how it goes. It's that desire that creates the universe, isn't it? The male desires the female desires the male. Each one desires something different from the other. In many ways, each one is blind to what the other one is. Having said that, if it's done correctly, if it's managed correctly, the male-female thing can be wonderful. I find that it can be. It can also rip your guts out, which it has done to me, and it's done to probably everybody. Has it taught me to hate? No. Has it made me bitter? No. I guess it still has the potential to do this, but I certainly hope that it doesn't. I'll put it that way. That kind of hate is a hate that I think I can do without, and it's really a go nowhere kind of hate. That's my view of the battle of the sexes. It's a battle, all right.